Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and whether you're joining us here in person on Park Avenue or online at stbarts.org, it is my joy and my delight to welcome you to the forum where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. And today we're going to be talking about something that really matters, wars that are happening around the world and the concept of war in general and a just war, whether such a thing exists and how it might exist and how it applies to the conflicts that exist in our world. And we're really honored to have with us Dr. Walter Dorn. He is Professor of Defense Studies at the Canadian Forces College and the Royal Military College, both in Toronto, Canada. He is a frequent commentator and consultant on issues of war and peacekeeping, and he is no stranger to the St. Bart's community as someone who visits the UN often. He and his wife Danielle, who's also here today, are frequent visitors to St. Bart's when they're in the city. Walter, thanks for being here this weekend as we mark Memorial Day and think about war and grapple with all the ethical dimensions of it. We're really glad that you're here.
Thank you. It's my great joy, and I feel a sense of love being in a church that's adopted me. Dean Wolfe was very kind to call this my spiritual home after I started coming here. And I feel it's my spiritual home away from home. When I come to New York City, I come to St. Bart's and I can worship with you all and glorify the name of God and make a spiritual connection, which is so important. I come for the United Nations in order to help the UN in any way I can with peacekeeping operations and with its noble cause. But when I do my work as a professor, I usually can't speak about the spiritual foundations that are really the basis why I do what I do. Professionally, I teach military officers at the command and staff level and the national security level. We have students coming to Toronto from Canada, the Canadian officers and majors to colonels, as well as students from around the world. The United States sends officers, as well as about 20 other countries. And typically I do the lectures on the just war tradition, which is great because it allows me to connect to some Christian themes, but I'm not able to explain it in fulsome what the connection is. And now today I can actually talk about just war theory in its origins, which actually was in Christianity. The origin of our faith is, of course, Jesus Christ. And if I had to characterize the teachings and the actions of Jesus Christ, I would say that he was a pacifist. He called for people to live in peace, and his example was one of peace. He died on the cross to not only save the people of his time, but also all time. And that was an example of tremendous sacrifice. And as we also acknowledge Memorial Day coming up tomorrow, that we also recognize the sacrifice of those who died in war. But going back to Jesus Christ, the original Christians who were following Christ, they were also pacifists. They allowed themselves to go be taken and brought to colosseums and fed to lions, and they knew that their reward was a higher one. And this pacifism pervaded for several hundred years. In fact, some of the early theologians, like Tertullian, stated that the pacifism was for all time. Tertullian said when Christ told Peter to put away his sword after he had cut off the ear of one of the ministers in the temple, Tertullian said when Christ took that action, he took it and disarmed all soldiers for the future. So that was the origin of the Christian view that you should take the evils, but then show far more good in return and not return evil with evil. And as Christians began to grapple with the practicalities of it, and particularly after the Emperor Constantine became a Christian, then the theologians had to adapt because now you actually had soldiers who were Christians. And the idea was, well, what's the role of Christianity in a soldier's life? and what's the role the soldiers have in Christianity. And particularly when Rome was sacked by barbaric forces, the Christian leaders had to say, what do we do about this situation when we're attacked? And very interestingly, St. Augustine, who lived around the year 300, St. Augustine said that you don't actually have a right to defend yourself, but you do have the right to defend others. So if you have to defend yourself in order to defend others, then self-defense is justified. But otherwise, you want to follow in the example of Christ, in that supremely powerful example. And so the theologians had to consider, well, when do you use force? So it's defending others was one of the just causes. And St. Augustine in his writings didn't come up with a theory, but he gave 3 of the principal elements that formed a foundation of just war theory. He said you should have a just cause. So I've already mentioned defending others. Then he said you have to have the right intent. And it's really quite profound. He said your intent of using force should be to establish peace, not for conquest, not for self-aggrandizement, not to act out of anger, but to create peace. And he also said that you should be a legitimate authority. They didn't want all these roving brigands and gangs taking authority and saying that they have the Christian right to apply force. He said you have to be the ruler in order to use force. So the ruler has a role to impose order and to create a just society. But also, if when attacked, then the ruler could respond. So that was the beginnings of thinking about something called just war theory. And I'll add some slides so that it can give you some imagery of these early thinkers. So we come with the idea that the Old Testament is very different from the New Testament. If you took the Old Testament as your basis, you would have a lot of grounds for using force. In fact, there are some passages in the Old Testament that are really blood-curdling, because it's so dramatic. Like in Deuteronomy, in the land that your Lord has given you, leave nothing that breathes alive. And although we have the 10 Commandments, those valuable basis for civilization, at least Judeo-Christian civilization, that thou shalt not commit murder, or thou shalt not kill in the King James Version. We have these Old Testament. I'm actually reminded of the time when President George W. Bush was given the Presidential Daily Brief, which is actually the highest level of intelligence that's usually given to the president in the mornings. And the people who were giving him the brief in 2003 in the lead up to the Iraq War were constantly putting quotes from the Bible at the beginning. And they didn't put New Testament quotes. Those wouldn't fit very well. They put the Old Testament quotes in there that was kind of encourage him to think about the valor of going to war. And what we see in the New Testament is a new gospel, a new message for the millennia of forgiveness. And as I said, St. Augustine, or Augustine if you want to use the the Roman phrase for his name, he proposed the criterion ad bellum, jus ad bellum, that they be the just cause, right intent, and right authority. Then it took many hundreds of years later that humanity entered into a very dark ages. And it wasn't until 1100s that Thomas Aquinas started to say, well, let's add to this philosophy that St. Augustine had given us. And he proposed, in addition, you should have proportionality of ends, which means that the net benefit from a war that you fight should be greater than all the damages and problems and all the negative aspects of that war. So you can also call it net benefit. Proportionality of ends. The good should outweigh the evil. And he also said you should only go to war when necessary. So it was a necessity component, which is now an important part of just war theory. Other scholars, also coming from the Christian faith, they further codified it, especially de Victoria, a Spanish theologian, and he added last resort. That is, you should not use force unless all other options have been exhausted or you know that they won't work. So that you aren't using force immediately and as an impulsive reaction, but only after you've considered all the other means, the peaceful means. And you should have reasonable hope of success, which is very close to the idea of proportionality of ends, that you should, obviously, if you're not going to succeed, then the net benefit will be very negative. Then Hugo Grotius, who is known as the father of international law, he started to add some other elements. You should only have legitimate targets when you're fighting war, only combatants. You should spare the civilian population. And you should have proportionality of means, not only proportionality of the whole war having a net benefit, but when you're actually taking military action, you should weigh the military benefit of taking an objective versus the damage that might be caused, the harm that might be caused, and that you shouldn't be disproportionate. So, for instance, when the New York Times asked me to write a guest essay about just war theory applied to Israel's actions in Gaza, the proportionality aspect came in very strongly. That is, in order to achieve the military objective of getting the hostages released and, in their minds, the objective of defeating Hamas as a military operation, that the proportionality was not kept there, that it was a very disproportionate response, now with over 36,000 lives lost in Gaza. And Hugo Grotius also had humane treatment of prisoners. So we had this original idea that when you do capture someone, you have to treat them humanely. All of these principles were captured in international law, including in the UN Charter. And when I do the lecture for the Command and Staff course, I show how the just war principles, the criterion, are embedded into the provisions of the UN Charter. And you're very fortunate to be here in New York, where the headquarters of the UN is. And another aspect of just war theory that has always been on my mind is, why do I like it so much? I, as a critical thinker, that's what I teach students to do, is think critically, look at what a theory offers and what are its disadvantages. And I find just war theory so appealing that I feel uncomfortable. And after a while, I realized that it was that there wasn't that much missing in it, because I thought, oh, it must be missing. If you can reduce it down to 7 criteria, then there must be something missing. But I realized that when you try and answer the question about force, why do you use force? Who should use force? When should you use force? What force should you use? Where? How? These are the 5 W's, or you can say 6 W's if you want to include the W in how. That just war theory answers them. It says, why do you use force? Well, we have those 3 original criterion for St. Augustine. You must have a just cause. You must have the right intent. You must have a net benefit, which you foresee from your actions. Who should use force? Legitimate authority. Now that can be open to interpretation, but it does give you a preliminary answer. What means should you use? Well, you should use proportionate means, not those that are disproportionate. When should you use force? Only after all peaceful means have failed. Where should you use your force? On military, not civilian targets. And how should you do it? Well, it's under right conduct. And in just war theory, there's a whole section dealing with use in bello as opposed to use ad bellum. First being ad bellum being the theory that deals with going to war, and the other is how do you conduct the war, use in bello. And just for some little interlude here, I'll show some of my favorite little political cartoons. Here is Hagar the Terrible, and he's saying to his men, I've asked Brother Olaf, who's obviously a priest, men, before we leave to sack Europe, I've asked Brother Olaf to say a few words. And he said, gentlemen, is this trip necessary? Well, it's the right response, right? The religious side says, look at it and really see, is this necessary? So that's one of the criteria of just war theory. Another one is a Gary Larson cartoon a little bit about this for humor's sake. He says, hot oil, We need hot oil. Forget the water balloons. So it's a little bit about proportionality of means. And then from your own New Yorker collection, here's a general at a cocktail party saying, look, I'd like to avoid overkill, but not at the risk of underkill. So there also a sense of what's proportional and what's not, and a little bit of ridiculing the military approach. Now, I was looking at how to apply this theory, not just to the current wars, but historically. How would you look at the wars being fought by different nations? So I looked at Canadian wars Canada fought, I looked at the wars the U.S. fought, and then did selective case studies of looking at the moral and spiritual basis using just war theory for these wars. And I decided that I would look at the 7 criteria and look at each war. And I would evaluate from -3 to +3, from being strongly unjust to strongly just, the overall war, but then also each of the 7 criteria. And so it was a lot of fun studying the wars, understanding the background, why they were started, and how they were fought. But I said it's not really, one academic's view, it's not going to be so important. So I put together a study where we sent out a survey to 1,000 PhDs in the International Studies Association. And then we had a response, about 100 of them responded. And then they evaluated all the wars that America has fought since 1900. And we had them fill out a survey. So for each war, to what extent do you agree or disagree the U.S. had just, whatever the criterion was, to use armed force in the following conflicts? And then we looked at World War I, World War II, Korean War, First Gulf War, etc. And then people would circle the value, the degree to which they thought it was just. And then we averaged them all at the end, and we called it the Just War Index. So this is the result. When we had 100 PhDs do the evaluation, we took each of the criteria and we put them in different colors, and then we added them up to see, or took the average actually of them. And on a scale from -3 to +3, none got over 2. So all wars properly were justified as having some components that were negative. If you look at this, you'll see that the World War II was considered the most just war. Then the anti-piracy mission off Somalia, Gulf War I, that is George Bush Sr. in 1991, acting to repel the aggression, the occupation of Kuwait. World War I, Bosnia intervention in the 1990s, Korean War, Iraq no-fly zone, Haiti intervention, that was in 1993 to push out the dictatorship that had seized power. Kosovo intervention in 1999. And Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan was the response to 9/11, which of course has resonance here in New York. ISAF, that is the mission created by NATO, well, originally the UN, but then NATO in Afghanistan. And then we get some which people are starting to dip into the negative. And the global war on terror, you can see some components were listed as negative. This survey was taken around 2008 to 2010. The Lebanon intervention, this is back in 1983 under Ronald Reagan. The Libya bombing campaign, that was 86. The Panama intervention to overthrow Noriega. The Vietnam War, of course, from the 60s. And the Iraq War in 2000, which was viewed as the most unjust war by the academics who were evaluating this. So this will give you a sense of how you can apply just war theory to actual conflicts. But it's open to criticism. Everybody can evaluate each war from their own personal perspective and their view of that war. Obviously, those on one side will view it from a different one. If you looked at the war in Gaza now, you'd see a very different view, whether you were pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian. But I would say that the just war is very important for giving you a framework for thinking. It really helped me to look, for instance, at the Gaza war, where I saw that the just cause was there to respond to the October 7th attacks, but that it was on the other criteria, like the proportionality, that there was really a big area where it would be a very negative score on that front. So by analyzing it, you can kind of put in your mind that you can't just say everything about it is wrong, but you can say there are certain aspects that are wrong. And that's what the criterion evolved through the centuries by the Christian theologians and then by international law have helped evolve. And also I find that just war theory is useful to me personally. Like sometimes I say, why I'm getting angry about something. So was it the cause? Is it my intent? What is it behind it? And what would justify me to assert force? That is there some cases where I actually have to give someone an elbow? Or the other day I was walking along Park Avenue and I saw one taxi driver throw a water bottle at another taxi driver. I have a feeling it wouldn't meet the just war criteria. Anyways, this is all a way that just war theory can help educate us as Christians and as human beings about the criterion. And of course, we're always getting inspiration from our Christian faith, from our connection to Christ, and from each other, from our fellowship and being in Christian fellowship as we are now. I also academically wanted to study other world religions. I said, well, just war theory was developed by Christianity, and here is a faith that went so radically different in practice from its founder, and yet still kept the spirit of Jesus Christ and managed to find the limits. It's a living faith. It's one that's evolved or grown and come up with new ideas over the centuries. And this is how it applied in Christianity. What about the other faiths? So I did look at 7 world religions, studied them, and I found that the same principles were very much in the other faiths. They were not codified as well. They didn't form as much of the basis of international law, but they had the elements. And I was in Nepal in February lecturing about Hinduism to Nepal Sanskrit University and the Nepali military, and showing how their faith also had these components of just war theory. And the International Committee of the Red Cross wanted me to look at Hinduism in particular so that they can, when they go to these foreign lands, particularly to South Asia, they can say, this isn't just a Christian ideology that we're imposing on you. Your own faith has these same elements. And because these different faiths have the same human impulses to exercise restraint on the use of force, you find these elements. But they vary in their complexity, in their codification, in the various elements. But it was fascinating to find out about those other faiths. And if you want to learn more about them, you can always ask Peter to invite me back. So I'll end with this beautiful quote, which you'll hear very often on Memorial Day, often used during services and militaries in the Christian world. That greater love hath no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And as we honor the sacrifice of those who died in war, of those who served in the military, and particularly those who kept our freedom, the freedom of us North Americans and of the Western world when there was both internal conflict in World War II and at other times, we have to truly give thanks for their sacrifice. Those who died while on a ship being worried about a torpedo that might come and sink their ship from some submarine that's lurking out there. Or there'd be the ground soldiers of World War I who, when the whistle blew, knew they had to go over the top from their trenches in order to face enemy gunfire and try and run as fast as they can to reach those machine guns before they mowed you down. Or those who are in the air, who are flying and knowing that they're going into enemy territory and receiving all kinds of surface-to-air threats with bombs exploding around them and their aircraft getting very rocky, perhaps sometimes losing a wing, having to parachute out into enemy territory. For all those people who took those sacrifices, we really have to be grateful. And the supreme gratitude is, of course, to the founder of our faith, Jesus Christ, who made his own sacrifice in body and blood for us and for all generations, that he set an example and gave us the teachings that are the foundation of our faith, and indeed, I would go so far as to say, the origin, the beginnings of modern international law, of which nations should abide, but of course, there's still no enforcement mechanisms. But we have the example of Jesus Christ to help inspire us for now and for all of our lives. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Walter. And we do have a good 20 minutes for questions. If you're here in the room, Suzanne Vorster, I believe, has question cards. Just raise your hand. She'll bring one around to you, and then you can hand it back to her. If you're joining us online, you can enter your questions into the live chat on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. And a few of you have already done that, which is great. So we have several questions already. I'm not surprised. I knew this was going to be a topic that was going to arouse a lot of interest in folks. Can we start with, you described Jesus as a pacifist. There are some Christian theologians who would say no war is just because of that. Can you respond to that criticism of Augustine?
Right. Yes, and I really admire the true pacifists. They are so principled, and many people have used their faith to be conscientious objectors, to say that I cannot serve in the military. And I admire that, and I understand it, and I think it's very principled. I think that it's not practical in the world today, because if we had had pacifists standing up to Hitler, they would have been just mowed down. And so many cases, the world needs international law enforcement, and we need enforcement actions like in the Korean War to prevent aggression. So it's a very practical matter that when we go from the pure divinity, which is complete peace, and come into human body where we realize relativity and we realize that people are acting completely improperly when they are hurting other people, when they are causing massacres, that there is a responsibility to act. So on the spectrum, the just war theory does not apply to those who are thinking as purely pacifists, nor those who are entirely anarchists, or anarchy in the sense that they want complete disorder. That just war theory covers most of the spectrum in between. And I can really still respect the pacifists, and I can see how they take the example of Jesus Christ as a pacifist urging.
We have several questions already about the Crusades and also about colonialism, the international slave trade, Christianity, and its some ideals, at least gleaned from Christianity, were used as justification for those efforts of force. Can you respond to what that says about our faith, but also how just war theory developed?
Right. We have to acknowledge that Christianity has been used as a tool for those in power, and that during the colonial period, the missionaries did play a role. They went with the right intent for the most part, but they were also used to as part of the use of force against indigenous populations all around the world. And as European civilization was spreading, there were a lot of bloody marks that we actually have to atone for as a faith, and recognize that they were wrongly done and wrongly committed. However, I would also say that the Christian faith did bring much inspiration and much relief to people, and there are still people who are inspired from the faith that was brought by those early missionaries. For instance, I worked in East Timor in 1999. It was under Indonesian occupation, and the authorities were persecuting the people. They had committed genocide for 24 years. And I would go to the services there, and I saw how much the East Timorese identified with Christ, with the persecution. And so they were able to better deal with it because of their faith. It really strengthened their faith. So we do have to recognize there are great blemishes in the Christian record in history, but we also recognize that at the times they were different rules that were applied, and now we have to apply our higher standards of today.
Can you reflect on how the changing nature of war has changed just war theory? How do these principles, or do they apply differently to the kind of technologically driven conflicts of today?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think that they apply equally as well. Just war theory came out of the time of the Roman spear, but now we have UAVs, artificial intelligence guiding aircraft and on-the-ground drones. So we really have a different mechanisms for carrying out the war, but the moral principles behind them remain the same. And of course, the spiritual principles remain the same about compassion for each other. And even for those fighting, they should know that they should still love their enemy. If they're taking military action against them, don't do it out of anger or hatred. Do it out of love, because you realize in the end that's the higher good. And so those principles are enduring. They're forever, even if the means have changed. That's the short answer. But I also work on technology, and that's what I mostly do at the UN. So I'm happy to elaborate on that when there's more time. Yeah.
Can you talk about the connection between theory and practice? You teach the theory, you look into the research, but you've also been on the ground in so many places around the world, and you teach folks who are professionally engaged in conflict and in the military apparatus. So can you talk about the gaps between theory and practice?
Yeah, that's where just war theory is so practical. Because if I just talked about creating peace on earth as a theory, you wouldn't have the ability to, well, what does that mean? And when can you use force? But just war theory answers it. So that's the really nice thing about just war theory, is it's very practical. It allows people to consider the different components and disaggregate the different components to be able to figure out when things are just and when they're not just. So very much a very practical philosophy, which is why I'm drawn to it. I mean, there are many political scientists who have like very elaborate theories that are far removed from reality, and they develop so many terms that you can't even understand what the terms are unless you're in a small clique. And I could write papers for a small clique, but I thought it's much more important to spend time working on something that is practical, hence just war theory.
You touched on this a bit already, but one person wonders why it has become so difficult for international law to be implemented.
Yeah, right, wonderful question. And it's one of the main themes of my career and my life working with the UN. We're still tribal societies. We still view nationalism above our humanity. We don't realize that in killing other people, we're actually killing ourselves. And if we say, well, we're going to kill Iraqis or whatever the other group it is, it's the othering. And they're not taking the Christian example that we actually are all one. And it's one humanity. And we have to realize that in order to create the mechanisms so that we'll give enough power to international bodies like the UN so they can actually enforce international law. And the mistake was made after World War II to give a veto to 5 permanent members, and we're still living with that mistake today, that enforcement action can be vetoed, as it is by Russia, or was on several occasions by Russia in Ukraine. So we need to overcome the obstacles. If we do have the vision, the power to create a third generation international organization. It was a U.S. president who brought us the first generation international organization under the League of Nations coming out of World War I, who very much had a Christian approach. That's why the treaty that embodied the first generation of international organization was called the Covenant. It was very much Woodrow Wilson who said that came out from his faith, that he wanted the nations of the world to sign on to a covenant. But that covenant wasn't good enough, so after World War II, we had to create the UN Charter. And now if we create a third generation, or we have the enlightenment to be able to evolve the UN to something stronger, then we would use stronger mechanisms and learn the lessons of the past.
A question about the International Court of Justice and its current actions regarding the war in Israel, the jurisdiction not being recognized by Israel and by the United States. Can you reflect on that?
Right. There's 2 courts in The Hague. The International Court of Justice, or ICJ, is called the World Court. And Israel and the United States do recognize the jurisdiction of the ICJ. It is part of the UN Charter. It's adjoined to it. So when you actually get a copy of the UN Charter, the little blue book, you'll see that the statute of the court is attached to it. And to be a member of the UN, you have to agree to the statute of the ICJ, International Court of Justice. The U.S. has said that there's two sets of rulings. South Africa and other countries have brought a case against Israel in the ICJ, and the ICJ has recently said that Israel should stop its advance on the Rafah in the southern Gaza. And it took provisions that it should, in hearing the case about whether this is genocide in Gaza, that Israel should take no actions that would allow the judgment the time that the judges need. So during that period, they say that you shouldn't take action that might. So it's probability in legal terms that might violate the Genocide Convention of 1948. The second court is the International Criminal Court, and it tries individuals. It's not a court between nations. And in that court, the prosecutor has asked the trial chamber for indictments against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel. And the U.S., and he also asked for 3 Hamas leaders, including Ismail Haniyeh, who is located in Qatar, and that he's a primary face of Hamas to the world. And the U.S., when they saw that those indictments came in, those 5 indictments, they said it's a false equivalence. They aren't the same. But from my point of view, a court will bring in somebody, a very powerful individual, and someone who's stolen a purse, and it doesn't mean that there's equivalence. You know, courts are there to be able to bring about justice at all different levels. So I don't see that U.S. argument as holding water, that there are a separate set of indictments that are requested for these two. And of course, Israel, having its prime minister indicted, sees that as being a threat to them. And they don't recognize, because you have to sign up to the Rome Statute of the ICC, not the ICJ, but the ICC. You have to sign up to it. And the U.S. had signed under Bill Clinton, but then unsigned it when George W. Bush came. And Israel is not party to the ICC either. So they say that it doesn't apply to us. However, the Palestinians did come to the ICC saying, we want to sign on, we are a state, and the Rome Statute of the ICC states that if violations have occurred on your territory, then the ICC has jurisdiction. So hence, Israeli violations inside Gaza would apply, and that's why the prosecutor can bring this case.
Can you reflect a little on the conflict in Ukraine with Russia?
Yeah, it's such an outright aggression by Russia on Ukraine. Really, the just war theory, in my view, would give it a very low score, a negative score, for the justice of Russia's invasion in 2022, and also its invasion in 2014 when it invaded Crimea and escalated and, started the war in Donbass. And Ukraine is struggling for its survival. It's in self-defense mode. It's been very restrained in its use of weapons inside Russia. It's abiding largely by the laws of armed conflict, by the Geneva Conventions, but you can't say the same thing about Russia. It's committed atrocities. It's perhaps genocide. It's violated on the prisoners of war and the Geneva Conventions, on the deliberate targeting of civilians. There's just so many aspects of Russia's action in Ukraine that are abhorrent and that really deserve to be indicted. And incidentally, Vladimir Putin was indicted by the International Criminal Court for deporting children from Ukraine into Russia. And that's a very significant development. I mean, in some ways, it's very impractical, but at the same time, it shows that the law is there to be able to indict people who have committed those kind of violations.
A question about preemptive actions and to what extent they can be justified by the just war theory.
Right, that's a great question too. There's a beautiful case between Canada and the United States. That was Great Britain at the time. And it found the basis for considering preemption. And preemption became such a important issue in the Iraq case, where there was an allegation that Iraq was developing WMD, so it had to be preempted in 2003. And there was now we know there was really no preemptive cause for the invasion of Iraq. But at the time that we really delved into the theory of self-defense, preemptive self-defense. And the case that really helped that is called the Caroline case. And it was a very interesting case, worth a little story, that the United States wanted to spread freedom to Canada, and the Canadians at the time didn't want it. They wanted to remain under the British Empire. And in 1835, or 34, 35, the U.S. started supplying weapons to some people who were liberators. In fact, one of them was Mackenzie King, who marched up the main street in my city, Toronto. And one or two people were shot, and that was the end of our War of Independence. But he wanted to keep doing it, so they brought to an island in the Niagara River. The water flows past Navy Island, then goes over Niagara Falls. And he was using a ship called the USS Caroline to ship arms across the Niagara River. And a colonel in Toronto decided that he would go to take the ship, and they seized it at night, and one Buffalo photographer died in that seizure, but they had warned the people who were taking the ship, and most of them had fled. They took the ship, they put it on fire, and yes, it went over Niagara Falls burning. And it was an act that the United States obviously said, well, why did you do this? This was on U.S. territory. You don't have a right to come in. And then Great Britain, under Lord Ashburn, said, and the Ashburn-Webster with the Secretary Daniel Webster, they came up with basic principles when you could consider it allowed to do self-defense. And it had to be when there was an imminent threat, when there was no other recourse to action, where you had instantaneous need to respond, then that could be considered a preemptive attack. And so they came to agreement that in the future, thankfully for our two countries, we haven't had war since the War of 1812, and we've actually the lake that I live on, Lake Ontario, is demilitarized under a treaty. So if the U.S. wants to send warships into the lake, any of the Great Lakes, they have to ask Canadian permission, likewise. So we created a very harmonious relationship between our two nations. And part of that was establishing the principles of when you could use preemptive self-defense.
Because Judaism and Islam play so much into the conflict in the Middle East right now, can you reflect a little on just war concepts within those two religious traditions?
Right, yeah. I do so with a little bit of trepidation. I draw inspiration from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Talmud, and also the Tanakh, and I get tremendous inspiration from them. The Old Testament has passages that are best viewed as appropriate to the Israelites of that day, but I can understand how Israelis, many of them, would want to apply it to the world of today. But the world has evolved. We have international law. We have rules. We have practice of nations. And a modern-day nation cannot use the texts of 3,000 years as a basis for its international law. It can use it as inspiration. It can use it for trying to understand the relationship with God, but not for the practice of national military affairs. So I'm open to criticism on that, but I think that it's very inappropriate to be using passages like the Prime Minister Netanyahu used when he refers to the Amalekites and what the Israelis were permitted to do under the Old Testament to the Amalekites. It's genocide.
And what about Islam?
Islam has a version of just war theory, and it's very much that you take action against the oppressor. And it has provisions. It actually says if you kill one innocent person, it's like you're killing the whole world. If you save one innocent person, it's like saving the whole world. And they have provisions. But the jihadists, the Islamists, they will use the provisions that are much more Old Testament-like rather than New Testament-like. And they will apply those about, cutting off the heads, et cetera, of those unbelievers and others. And it's very inappropriate use, I think, of those scriptures, and also it's a scripture meant for a time and a place. But again, I wouldn't want to take away from any Muslim person to draw inspiration from their holy texts. Just don't apply it to modern-day international law.
And there's some terrifying stuff for Christians in Revelation, let's say. There's some militarism there, too.
Yeah, that's the other thing. So just war theory applies to human affairs, but if you go into God's area, there are so many other things that we have no conception of. That God has so much more power and knowledge, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, that we can't know the will of God. And there may be times, maybe in the Old Testament, maybe at the time of the Quran, when there was God's will that was written up, and it may come in the future in some sort of revelation, but that's not the way human beings should conduct their affairs. That is led up to God. So in the Judaism, they have the idea of God-commanded wars, and those are separate from human-decided wars. The God-commanded wars are something that you can't actually question because they're commanded by God.
We're coming close to the end of our time. A question about the impact of whether a war is just or not on soldiers. Is PTSD greater for soldiers? Do we know if there's been an unjust war? And kind of looking at that chart and how historians have evaluated different wars, how do veterans of the Vietnam War or the Iraq War feel when something that they risked their lives for is then kind of claimed to be unjust?
Yeah, so we do know that people who have fought in an unjust war have more chance of PTSD because post-traumatic stress disorder comes to people who have that conflict in their mind about what they did. And whether it be the strategic picture of what war they're fighting in or the tactical things of shooting at another human being, it wrestles with the human soul, with our conscience. And I would say here just war is quite helpful. The just war talks about the rules ad bellum, going to war, and the soldier doesn't have responsibility for that. So they should take off their mind that they're duty-bound to obey orders as long as they're legal, and they will serve their nation. And if they follow the ad bellum, their role is in bello, but the ad bellum is done by the nation state, so they shouldn't bear that on their conscience. But it's the in bello, the rules. If they broke the in bello rules, that is how you use force, then it's much more justification for self-condemnation and consideration.
Finally, we here in the U.S. and many places around the world are going to have an election this year. As voters, as people of goodwill, people of faith, how should the tenets of just war theory impact our decisions in the ballot box and in the voting booth?
Well, being a Canadian, I wouldn't want to discuss anything about U.S. election politics. However, I will say that the decisions on going to war are so important for our world. We live in a world which can destroy itself. We're not necessarily talking about revelations. We're talking about the ability of human beings with nuclear weapons to destroy this planet. And we have to consider the issues of war and peace are so important. So they have to be done with a very steady hand, not for any selfish purpose, not for the desire for any personal gain. They have to be done for the welfare of humanity. Even national interest, when it comes to nuclear war, should take a second role to the interests of humanity. And so, these just war theory applies to those who can actually have the discernment to be able to look at the component parts, to be able to make wise decisions, and take a God-given talent and use that to guide the nation, this great nation of the United States of America, into the future. and guide it wisely, because it plays such an important role in the world today. It is the main enforcer, the main supporter of international law. And it's so important that for the rest of the world, all of us who can't vote and yet are influenced by this vote, that the United States maintain its and build upon its support for the United Nations, for the international law, that treaties be constructed, not shredded.
Please join me in thanking Walter Dorn.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I love the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Walter. Thank you all for being here. We hope you'll stick around and join us for worship, whether here in person or online, in just a few minutes at 11 a.m. And I also hope you'll be back next week. It's going to be CYF Sunday here at St. Bart's, and we're going to hear from Lisa Miller, a professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, about the spirituality of children. See you then.
Great, super. That was great.
I'm going to run there, but I'll see you.
Yeah, sure.